So hello friends, we're back with our Stitch Composer program. This is going to be the second in our tutorials about how to learn how to use the Stitch Composer program, which is part of the Janome Horizon Link suite software for the 15,000 machine. It is part of the Horizon Link program for the 12,000 machine, and it's also a part of the program in the AccuTool S program that comes with the Skyline 9 machine, all of which are really great sewing and embroidery machines from the Janome lineup. So today I'm briefly going to just open up the Horizon Link program for the 12,000 machine because I'm going to show you very quickly one of the main differences between the 12,000 program and the 15,000 program. So as soon as my program decides that it's going to launch, if you've never used this before, you're going to see, we were looking at the 15,000 program in our first lesson, and when we had our start page open up, we had about 4 programs that were showing here in this opening screen. AccuTools, I think is going to be very similar to the 15,000, but we'll look at that in a little few moments. But the 12,000 machine, you're not going to see a link here on the opening page for the Stitch Composer program, and where you're going to find that on the 12,000 Horizon Link is going to be here underneath Tools. So if I hit this Tools tab, I'm going to find that it opens up a screensaver tool, and it's also going to open our Stitch Composer. So I will just double click on Stitch Composer in Horizon Link, and it will launch the program. And as soon as you see this, you're going to see the one major difference between the 12,000 program, for those of you that have that machine, and the 15,000. And that is the screen itself, where all the digitizing is going to be done to create the stitches. You're going to notice that it has this curved shape to it. And the reason that I wanted to open this up and show you this is because it might help to make a little bit more sense to you about what direction it is that we are going to be creating our stitches. So I want you to visualize what your decorative stitch feet look like. That would be your F foot, which is the closed toe version of your decorative stitching foot, and the F2 foot. I don't have one here to show you because I'm not savvy enough yet to figure out how to insert pictures here. But the F and the F2 feet, the opening that the stitches are created in, have this slight curvature to them. And the needle drops down, so we can visualize it here. This would be the plastic section. Your toes would be sticking out here and here. This would be the stitching area that your stitches are going to be formed in. And this plastic area has a slight curvature to it. And from what I have heard about Janome, they said that the reason they originally designed this screen with this curve to the grid marks is because they wanted it to simulate what the shape and the opening of that foot looked like. Okay, so when you open up the 15,000 version and the AccuTool S version, you're going to see that they straightened out this grid. I feel like it's a little bit easier to use a straight grid rather than a curved one. The stitch points are created exactly the same, but for some of us who have both programs, I would just suggest that pick the one that's going to work the best for you. The only thing that you need to keep in mind, my friends, is if you have multiple sewing machines with different programs running, meaning Horizon Link Suite for the 15,000, Horizon Link for a 12,000, AccuTool S for a Skyline 9, the only way you're going to be able to send your designs to your machine is if you have the appropriate program running for your machine. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So I'm going to close down Horizon Link for the 12,000. We're going to quickly open up the AccuTool S program for the Skyline 9, and we'll just take a quick look at what that screen looks like. I personally have not used AccuTool S for digitizing any Stitch Composer programs, but you're going to see here, very similar to the 15,000 Horizon Link Suite, it has its own little section for Stitch Composer. I double click on it, it launches, and we've got almost an identical screen to what the 15,000 version looks like. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that is the main difference between the 12,000 program and the 15 and the Skyline 9 program. This one will have a straight grid just like the 15,000 machine has. Okay, but other than that, the buttons are all going to be the same. I believe I'm wrong about that. I did not point it out on the 12,000 machine. it would be this one that would be different on the 12,000. Instead of a lock stitch button for the 12,000, you're going to have a finish tool. Okay, so we'll close that, close down AccuTool S, start up our Horizon Link Suite. And I want to first of all remind you that I did give you the folder that was called the Stitch Composer class folder. I'm opening the wrong program. Oh, it's going to just take a few seconds. Let me shut that down. And if you haven't used this pattern combo tool, we might get a chance to take a look at that in another future class. But for right now, it is Stitch Composer I want. I don't know why I clicked the wrong one, but I did. Okay, so here we are with Stitch Composer. And as I started to say before I accidentally opened the wrong program, I want you to remember where the tutorials are and the files that I gave you for class, where you stored them at. On my computer, I put mine into this PC in your documents folder. Remember that I had you all create a folder called Janome 15K because all of you in class were Janome 15,000 users. And within the Janome 15K, I wanted you to put your Stitch Composer class folder in there. The reason why is, again, just to stay organized so that when you want to try to find things that pertain to your sewing machine or things that you've been learning about your machine, keep them organized, please, on your hard drive of your computer so that you're not searching around or not able to find them later. So in this Stitch Composer class folder, there are more things in that folder than what just showed up now that I opened the folder up. All that's going to show here is this folder, which was Alter, and this one, which is Clips. And that is the reason why, is because now that we are actually running in this program, the only kind of files that Stitch Composer is going to want to open are either stitch files, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you in class number 1, but .stx is the format for a stitch file in the Stitch Composer program. So this program will open STX files. All right. And if I wanted to choose one of these, again, I have my preview window selected. I could just quickly glance at the 3 that I loaded on here for you to play with. You're going to see them there in the little preview screen. Okay. So I'm going to come back up here. Instead of looking at the Alter folder, I'm going to look at the Clips folder. Notice that nothing shows up. And it's the reason why is because this computer program right now is searching for stitch files, .stx files, when I opened up that open button. Okay. And so that's why not much is going to show up here. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to use the program and you have launched it and you're trying to open something up, it will only open up STX files. All right. All right. I just wanted to make sure that you understood that, because later on what we're going to do is we're going to be working with some images, and we're going to look at that in our View tab under Backdrop Images. If I were to open this up, and I am over here in my Documents folder, in my Janome 15,000 machine, Stitch Composer class, if I look at the Clips folder and open this up, this is where I put some JPEG files of different stitch patterns that would be really fun to insert into the program and try to copy them and make them into STX files. So now that I'm in this Backdrop Image section, I can open up a JPEG image and make that into a stitch file. So I'm hoping that that makes sense to you. What I'm doing here is I'm opening a JPEG to insert as a backdrop image, and that is different from opening a stitch file. What we're going to look at right now is a little bit more about the screen that you're going to be digitizing in. Whenever you're creating a stitch and you're starting from scratch, you need to pay attention to your screen, and you see here on the horizontal tool of this toolbar, you're going to see measurements in millimeters. Your sewing machine also reads in millimeters, and so this is just a real good way for you to relate the information that you have already become familiar with on your sewing machine, that when you are adjusting stitch lengths and stitch widths, etc., it's in a millimeter format typically. Some of us have switched our Janome 15,000s over into an English system, but I like to keep mine in metric because it just makes a little bit more sense to the way that I think. But when you start making stitches in Stitch Composer program, you always have to start on this 0 millimeter vertical line, this one right here. It doesn't matter where on this line you start. It can be anywhere from the top or the bottom of it, but it has to start on the 0 millimeter. All right. The other thing that you need to remember about that, and I'm just going to place a stitch point here at the 0. Stitch number 1 has been created. I'm going to just make a couple of little stitches. I am not planning a stitch pattern right now. What I'm trying to show you is that if you were stitching this out on a sewing machine, this would be the right side of your fabric, this would be the left side of your fabric. So the machine is going to be stitching. Here would be, pretend this is your needle point, and you would be sewing along in this direction. All right, so keep that in mind when you're creating your stitches. This is the right side of the foot, this is the left side of your foot. The other thing that you need to keep in mind as you're making stitches is that the way that a sewing machine functions, you can make a stitch all the way up to the entire width of your sewing machine that the machine will feed in. Our machines are 9 millimeter stitch width. This program here is about 4 plus 4 is 8, 9, and we've got about 4.5 actually in stitch width, or excuse me, 8. A little bit over 8.5 millimeters in width is as wide as these stitches are created. So that's a slight bit narrower than the built-in stitches on your sewing machine, which can be stitched out at 9 millimeters wide. So you notice that my stitch 5 is down here, stitch 6 is up here. My machine doesn't have any problem making a stitch that is that wide. But guess what? It cannot make a stitch in length any longer than 5 millimeters. So if I were to try to make my next stitch all the way out here, guess what happens? It's exceeding the maximum stitch length, which is 5 millimeters. So I just need to acknowledge that, oh, okay, I cannot make a stitch that long. I can make one, I'm going to move over here to a solid grid line. That's at 5. So if I went all the way to 10, see, that's going to let me make a 10 millimeter long stitch. It will not let me make one that's all the way up to 16 millimeters. It's exceeding the length. So what that is telling you is, and if you think about this in terms of what you're familiar with on your own sewing machine, the longest stitch length that you can make a straight stitch on your sewing machine is 5 millimeters long. We oftentimes use that to create basting stitches to temporarily hold something together. Same principle holds forth in Stitch Composer program. We cannot make a stitch longer than 5 millimeters, but we can make it all the way as wide as this stitch field here, like if we wanted to make a really wide satin stitch. So hopefully that makes sense to you. I'm going to use my backspace button. I'm just going to get rid of everything that I have done so far. What I would like for you to do is take a little look at the tutorial that is in your Stitch Composer class materials that I gave to you. The first tutorial in there is called Getting Started with Stitch Composer. And in that handout, they've got a very simple little stitch file that you can create. If you're familiar with making applique stitches, you know it's called a blanket stitch, and basically it runs in this fashion. A stitch is going to run along the edge of the fabric, a stitch that will come in, it will come back down, run along the edge, come up, come down, run along the edge. That's what is called a blanket stitch pattern. So that would be just about the easiest thing that you could create for your very first practice at making a stitch composed stitch file. And they've got some instructions in there that make a very nice looking little blanket stitch pattern. You don't really need to follow the directions for it unless you really wanted to, but it would be a nice little practice for you to make one and just see how it stitches out, and that could be your very first practice file. The way that they would have you make it is start off over here again on the 0 millimeter line and just create a long stitch along the edge, and then the little bites that are going to go in along your fabric. So what I'm going to do is I am going to create one. You know, the way I'm a right-handed person, and I'm very strongly right-handed, and many times when I am doing applique on my sewing machine, I want my machine to stitch out with, let's pretend like this is my applique fabric. I want my stitches to form along the right side of that fabric because it's just a little bit easier for my eyes and my brain to look at it. So if I were to create a applique, stitch, I would probably start on the right side of the sewing machine foot rather than on the left side of the foot. That would be the main difference that I would advise you to consider if you decide to do the little written tutorial that is in the Getting Started with Stitch Composer handout, is because they have you create it from the left side. I'd like to do mine from the right, and because I can do anything I want with Stitch Composer, I'm going to start from the right. Not too long ago, I saw a little article that was written in, I believe it was in the Bernina newsletter that they put out about once a month. And one of the ladies was talking about how she felt that the applique stitches that are built into our sewing machines are just too neat looking. In other words, what she wanted was something that looked a little bit more as if it had been done by hand. So it would be a little bit wobbly, in other words, rather than straight on. So that's what I'm going to try to create. I've just placed my stitch number 1 at my 0 orientation line. And what I'm wanting to do is I'm going to make a real strong stitch pattern. In other words, what I want to do is I want to do my outside edges of my applique. I want them to fall on top of each other. I think probably about 3 times. Just kind of keep this also in mind that you always, if you're going to stitch on top of yourself, the stitches placed on top of themselves, you're going to have to do them in odd numbers. So if you're going to be traveling forward, so this is what I want you to just watch me do. Number 1 is at 0. Number 2 is there. I'm going to backtrack on myself, and then I'm going to repeat where I was at. So I've got 3 stitches formed. I'm now at stitch point number 4. If I wanted to make this to be a little bit stronger stitch line, I could go back and then one more time. So now I've got 5 stitches placed right smack dab on top of themselves. It's a little bit cumbersome for your sewing machine to stitch on top of itself too many times, and so I would just warn you that just be a little bit careful when you are doubling up or tripling or 5 times or 7 times on top of each other, that you are building up a lot of bulk, and that's a lot of times that your needle is penetrating the same spot on the fabric. So just kind of keep it in mind that you don't want to double up too much on top of yourself. The next stitch point is not going to be placed directly on top of this one. I'm going to come over here and just make sort of a little wobbly stitch. I'm going to come back. I'm going to do it 2 times, 3 times, okay? My next one's going to be all the way to here, and I remember I'm going to go 5 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This time I'm going to make it maybe not quite as long as this one, slightly shorter. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to come all the way to 6. So I'm jumping by 2 millimeters each time. Notice that. This time I'm going to come a little bit straighter. 1, 2, 3, 4. Jump over to 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to do a stitch about here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is all I'm going to do for this stitch pattern. Now I can stop right here, because what I also have to keep in mind is my stitch pattern is going to loop starting from this starting point. So if I'm making an applique pattern, what I would want to have happen next is I would want my stitches to continue forming along this edge, and then it would repeat what I have created here. I'm going to hit the lock stitch button. All the stitch patterns have been created, or the stitch points have been listed here in the stitch point list. I am going to turn on my view button, and nope, where am I at? I want to hit the play. Where's play on here? Oh, simulation. So I'm going to hit my play button, and down here on the bottom you're going to start to see what my applique stitch looks like. And it's just going to repeat itself over and over again. And as you can see, it's a little bit wonky. And if I decided that that was just exactly perfect and it's what I wanted to see happen on my primitive applique project that I'm trying to make, then I would say I love it and I'm going to keep this stitch pattern. So what am I going to do next? I'm going to come back to my home screen. Now this is where another personal preference comes in, that I get to tell you what my personal preference is. I don't like to save the stitch pattern using my Save As button in the hard drive of my computer until I have first sent it to my sewing machine. by using the Write a Design function over here. Practice stitching it out with some decorative stitching thread on a piece of stabilized fabric. And if I like the results, then what I do is I go back to my computer and then I save it permanently on the hard drive of my computer. I do not ever save a stitch file in there that I have not practiced stitching out and I'm completely happy with. And the reason why is I just don't want to clog up my Stitch Composer folder on my computer with a lot of designs that I'm never going to use or that I'm not really happy with. Now, having said that, there have been times when I have attempted to make pretty complicated stitch files and they need a little bit of tweaking over time. And so those ones I will save if I've put a lot of time and effort into creating something and I just am not completely happy with it, then I will go ahead and save it. But if it was something simple like this and I wasn't happy with it, I would not bother to save it on the hard drive if I was not happy with the way it's stitched out. So how do I send this to my sewing machine? I am going to, first of all, talk about using your USB stick to do that. And what we have talked about in class, it was in your supply list, was that you needed to have your USB stick formatted to your embroidery machine. So if you've been using it for embroidery projects, notice I just inserted my USB stick and the little sign just came up in the lower right hand corner to say that its computer is recognizing it. Okay, so my USB stick that I am using today has been formatted to my machine. It's got tons of stuff on it right now, actually. Some older folders on here from other Janome programs that we used to operate from. Here's my EMB folder that holds embroidery designs for my embroidery part of my sewing machine. Remember that I've also mentioned to you also many times in embroidery classes, don't have a lot of stuff on here. And as you can see in my EMB folder, I don't have a whole lot of things that I'm storing here. It's transportation, not storage. So where is this going to go? It's going to go into the ORD file, the ORD. So these are the two folders that were created, EMB and ORD, when you formatted your USB stick on your sewing machine. Okay, I'm just going to close this for now and come back over here to the Stitch Composer screen. So if I'm going to practice stitching this out on my sewing machine, I need to send it to my machine. And the simplest way really is to use the Write a Design. So I will select on it. And because I've got two USB sticks in my computer at this point in time, I have this one that is in my E drive, and this is the USB that I just now inserted, the one that's in the H drive. First step of all of this is to select the one that you want. And here we are in the ORD folder, and it automatically is going to open up because that's where Stitch Composer wants to send the design, is into the ORD folder. Next thing you need to think about is, what are you going to name this thing? This is the default name, is SC for Stitch Composer, but you do not want to create lots of stitches and have them all want to overwrite themselves. So you always are going to have to rename your stitch file. So the first thing that you will do is, once this ORD folder is opened up, you're going to hit the rename button and you're going to think of a name for your stitch. Now, this is where your imagination is going to have to kick in, and you're going to have to think about, how am I going to name my files? Because I've had multiple brands of sewing machines, and as I mentioned in class, I have at times attempted to duplicate some of the stitches from those machines into Janome stitch files. I usually will start off with a letter. Now, if I was taking something from my FOF machine, I would start off by naming this. This is a reproduction of a FOF file, for example. So I would start with a P for FOF. And then I might call it, you're going to have to abbreviate things quite a bit, because the Stitch Composer part of your, not the Stitch Composer, the Created Stitches folder on your sewing machine will not read a big old long complicated name. So you're going to have to sort of use code words and numbers, etc., for things to make sense to you. So if this is a FOF stitch, I'm just pretending it's a FOF stitch. It's not. I'm going to call it an applique, A-P-P, and I'm going to call it applique number 1. All right, and then I would say OK. You will notice now that in the little box it is saying that it's a FOF applique 1 stitch. And if I wanted to send it, I would hit this button. But what I first want to do is, I can actually just leave it in this main big folder here, Or I could open up the ORD F, and you can see that I've got some other stitches in ORD F, and that's where I'm going to send this one. And I'm just going to hit the arrow button, and it wrote onto my USB stick. The next thing I could do is I could come down here to my bottom toolbar, safely remove hardware and eject media. Select that. This was this USB I was using, this one here, and I would select this. Everything jumped a little bit. This is the way my computer works, which just indicated that the computer said goodbye to the USB stick and it's ready to pull out and take to my sewing machine and practice stitching out my little applique stitch. Okay, which I'm not going to do right now because I'm teaching the class. So that is the very, very basic of how you would create a very simple, kind of cute, probably wonky little applique stitch. After I take this to my sewing machine and practice stitching it out with some decorative thread, and I've decided that maybe it needs a little bit more tweaking, what I would then do is I would bring that USB stick back to my computer, and the first thing that I would choose to do with it probably is to I was going to say that I would probably want to delete it off of there, but maybe if the stitch didn't need a whole lot of tweaking, and if my computer Stitch Composer program was still open and running and this stitch was still up on the screen, what I could then do is I could come back over to the screen, and I wouldn't bother with what is written on the USB stick right now. What I would then do is I would come to the home screen, and let's just say that I want to move some of these stitches. Let's just say, for example, that I decided I didn't want them to be as narrow, and let's just say I wanted to have a wider stitch pattern happen. I could hit this point and move, turn on the point and move button. I don't know if you noticed this, but all the stitch points are going to turn into a lavender color when I turn the point move button on. See, right now they're blue, and the final stitch, or the last stitch that was created in my stitch pattern, is a red dot. When I select point and move, everything turns lavender, which means I can now move these stitches wherever I want to. For example, I'm going to select stitch number 12, and I'm just going to bring it down a little bit wider. And number 10 was underneath it. You couldn't see that stitch number because it was covered up by 12. I'm going to move 10 and 12 together. I'm going to move 21 down to about there, and I'm going to move 19 underneath it. And number 35, I think I'm going to take it down about that wide and that wide. What does that look like now that it's stitching out? See, it's looking like a little bit like a more wobbly and more grass-like. So that's how you move stitch points while you're designing your stitch pattern. If I like that and I think it's stitching out quite well, because I have already selected the lock stitch button, and you can see these additional little stitches right up here that were put in when I selected lock stitch. Selecting lock stitch enabled it to simulate the stitching out in a continuous pattern, but it also completed it, so it is ready to send back to the sewing machine. So I would come back to write a design. Oh, and guess what? Because I deselected, I removed my USB stick, I would have to install my USB stick again. Here, my computer. I'm going to select it, send it back in. Here it is. I'm going to open it up, USB drive. You get to see all the sound effects. I'm going to open the ORD-RF file again. This time, what I want to do is I want to remember that I've already designed this stitch one time, and it was called P-App1, FOF Applique 1. I need to rename it. Again, do I want to start all over again, or do you think I might want to keep this? It's up to you. The answer to the question is up to you. So what I would maybe select to do this time is rename it, and this time I'm going to call it FOF Applique 2. If I say OK, this one is preserved under the name of P Applique 1. This one's going to be called P Applique 2. I can send it to my stick, USB stick. Now I've got 2 applique stitches on there. I can take this now to my sewing machine, practice stitching it out, and maybe I want to keep both of them. Maybe I'll only want to keep one. It's up to you. If you don't want to keep it, I would suggest that you can either delete it off of the USB stick while it's in your sewing machine, or you can bring it back to your computer and you can delete it from there just using your Files Explorer button. And what you could do then I'm going to open up File Explorer. I'm going to look for my USB-H. I'm going to open my ORD file, the ORD F within it, and I'm going to find my PFOF1 and PFOF2. Okay, look at this. I'm glad I did this because now I can also show you another thing. STX is the actual stitch file. The SBX is another file. It has the same name on it, and I think I'm correct in saying this, that what this part is it's an image of the stitch file. So if we were back in our Stitch Composer program and we were opening up the stitch file, remember when we were in that preview screen, a little picture showed up of what the stitch file looked like. I believe that I'm correct in saying that the SBX is the image of the stitch, and that's what will actually appear in that preview window. I could be wrong, but I think that that's what it's there for. Now, on my USB stick, if I decided I did not want to keep the SBX on this memory stick, on the USB stick, I could select them and I could delete them if I wanted to, and it would not affect the ability of the machine to stitch out the STX file. Okay, so if I wanted to delete them, all I would need to do is select them. I could either use my Shift button and hold it down and select all 4 of those samples that I just made, and then I could hit my delete button on my keyboard and they would be gone forever. But if I did not want to delete them, I'm just going to show you how to save them. Let's just say that I only want to keep, let's say I only want to keep the number 2 version. What I could do with it is I would select those 2. I'm just holding down my Shift key as I'm selecting so that they both have turned blue. I'm going to right click on them. I'm going to copy them. I'm going to come back to my document folder. I'm going to find my 15K folder, Janome 15K, open it up, and I'm going to save it here in my Created Stitches folder. There's nothing in there right now. So what I did is I just double clicked on it to open it and show you that there was nothing in there. But because I have right-clicked and copied those 2 files, now that I'm here in this folder, all I need to do is right-click on top of that folder, and I can select Paste. And now, when I open it up, I can see that those 2 stitches are in that Created Stitch folder, and they're safe on my hard drive for now. But again, if I decided that they just weren't up to par and I did not want to keep them, I could always come back into this folder on my computer. I could delete them, and so I don't have to have too many stitches in there that I don't plan to ever to use. All right, so that is part 2 of using Stitch Composer program, where I designed a very simple, wonky, kind of heavily stitched applique stitch. And I think I will probably take it to my machine and stitch it out and see if it's something that I might like. You know, decorative stitches don't have to be fancy stuff. It can just be something that is suiting the exact purpose for a project that you're working on, and that is one of the great things about the Stitch Composer program. Okay, I want you to create yourself a little applique stitch. Could be similar to mine, or it can be something a little bit different. It's a very simple little stitch pattern to practice on, and send it to your sewing machine, practice stitching it out, and see how you do. Okay, so that's all I have to say for right now about this particular class with your first attempt at designing your first Stitch Composer design. Have fun with it.